Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a review of the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette. And that's this gorgeous beauty here. Look at all of those shades. This is like the closest you can get to having a rainbow palette that is still super chic and kind of muted and, you know, good for everyday looks, but also good for something a bit more colorful. So I am a huge fan of this eyeshadow palette, and this was in my 2020 eyeshadow favorites video. So if you haven't checked that out, please do. And today I'm going to do my best to hopefully give you guys swatches, a demo, and review of this palette. And I say hopefully because I have actually filmed around 5 or so videos with this palette. And of course, if you look at my channel, you won't see those videos on there because I don't know if this palette is for me cursed or something like that, but every single time I try to film with this palette, something goes wrong. So usually the lighting is super off for some reason, or at one time I just forgot to press record. So I don't know, I have a lot of problems whenever I try to film with this palette. So today I've checked the lighting and everything. I think the conditions are at least acceptable. So let's hope that this video turns out well and you guys will actually end up seeing this on my channel. So this palette was actually one of my first luxury eyeshadow palettes, and this is probably the most expensive palette I have in my collection because it's $129, whereas my Pat McGrath Mothership palettes are $125. So I have been using this palette for a while and, you know, trying to get my money's worth from it. So the impressions I'll be sharing with you guys today are really based on using this palette for quite a long time. So without further ado, let's get into some swatches and I'll show you how I got this look and then tell you about my overall thoughts and impressions about this palette. So now let's get into some swatches. So the way this palette is laid out is it's in Natasha Denona's grid system, which means that every quad and every column and every diagonal of 4 is meant to be a look in and of itself. So of course you can really use these shadows in any way that you want, but that's just meant to be a little bit of a guideline in case you look at this and you're just like, wow, okay, where do I even get started? That's one way to think about creating looks with this. So first we have Rust, which is a vibrant rustic sienna metallic. And then we have Troop, which is a dark army green matte, and this is in her cream to powder formula. Sorry, those are a little bit wonky. Next we have Orium, a coral with light greenish reflex, and this is a dual chrome. This is one of my favorite shades in this palette and is scattered all over my lids today. It really just brings a party to any look that you're creating. And by the way, all of these shadows are super, super smooth and creamy in the swatch. Next, we have Shield, an olive green metallic. Ooh. Next, we have Ripe, which is a coral terracotta matte. So this is in her creamy matte formula, which is different from her cream to powder matte formula here. Next, we have Stain, which is a dirty apricot matte. And this is in the cream to powder formula. Next, we have Mace, a copper nude metallic. And then we have Rope, a warm beige matte. And let me just swatch that one again for you guys. And Rope is a creamy matte. Next, we have Fuse, a rustic high shine gold. Ooh, look at that. That is very, very high shine. And then we have Lethal, an avocado green matte. Favorite and also least favorite shade in this palette. Next, Penny, which is a high shine bronze. Wow, look at that shine. I mean, in general, like these 3 are all metallic formulas, but as you can see, they are very, very high shine. And we haven't even gotten into the chroma crystals yet. Next, we have Chrism, which is a peach matte. And this is in the cream to powder formula. And then Aqueous, which is a vibrant aqua taupe metallic. I don't really see the taupe in this shade, but definitely Aqueous is the right name for this because it just, you know, reminds you of anything aquatic. So I am definitely out of room on this arm. So let's switch over to my other arm. So first we have Queen, which is described as a pearly pink champagne metallic. And I actually, on my skin, don't really see the pink with this. I would say it's just more your straightforward champagne shade, but really gorgeous and really important in this palette. So you have a go-to inner corner and brow bone highlight. Next, we have Blaze, and this is the first Chroma Crystal shade. And this is described as a champagne gold high shine. And yeah, look at that. It's so gorgeous, so textured and high shine. I mean, you can see the metallics here are very high shine, but this is very high shine. Next, we have Noble, which is a taupe metallic, and Blaze is kind of flaking off my arm. Let me try to lay that on a little bit more. The Chroma crystals are definitely very textured. So as you can see from my finger, you definitely can pick up a lot if you're not careful. Next, we have Imperia, which is a brassy gold metallic. So here you can see a little bit of the difference between the metallic and Chroma Crystal. So Chroma Crystal definitely is more textured and has a bit more shine to it, but definitely the metallic is very shiny as well, and just slightly less textured, so it's not gonna flake off as much. Next, we have Royal, which is a dark forest green matte, and this is in the cream to powder formula. And then we have Crest, which is a rosy coral metallic. So this metallic, I would say, is a little bit more muted than some of the more golden metallics that we've seen so far. Next, we have Enigma, which is a midnight blue matte, and this is also in the cream to powder formula. Then we have Pure, which is a brown old rose matte. I don't really know what old rose means, but sure, I guess when you see the shade, you can kind of see some of that muted rose undertone to it. So I'm assuming that's what she's referring to. Okay, so here's where we are so far, and I still have one more row to go. So I'm gonna have to try to really pack these on a little bit more tightly. So next we have Azoic, which is a mustard taupe brown shade. Then we have Jubilee, which is a vibrant teal metallic. Really starting to run out of arm room here. Then we have Symbol, which is a deep teal metallic. Deep teal matte, not metallic. Then Rhizome, which is a warm mustard matte. Alrighty, so I think I'm officially out of room on my arms, so I'm going to do the remainder of the swatches on the back of my hand. So here are our last three shades. So we first have Claret, which is a rosy coral metallic, and then Helena, which is a light apricot with pink reflex shimmer. And Helena is another one of those Chroma Crystal formulas, so more textured and high shine. And then finally we have Antique, which is a dark pink brown matte. Alrighty, there we go. So all 28 shades swatched. Yes, there is eyeshadow everywhere around my desk right now, but isn't this gorgeous? This palette is so beautiful. So now that we have all the swatches down, before we go into the demo, I just want to share some overall thoughts about the colors in this palette. So first off, I would say, at least on my skin, these shadows tend to run a little bit more orangey. So as you can maybe tell, even some of the more neutral shades sort of have a little bit of oranginess to them. And overall, in the context of this palette, I think that's fine, just because it makes all of the colors cohere a little bit better. It is just something to make a note of, because you might look at this palette and think they also have just very plain neutral shades in here, but a lot of the neutrals will actually look a little bit more orangey when applied to the lids. The other thing I'll just mention is there is a decent amount of redundancy in this palette, and I mean, that's fair. It's 28 shades, right? And you want to have a coherent color story. You do just have a lot of these kind of gold and orange shades. It might be a little bit hard to tell in the swatches because they're very interspersed, but take, for example, these two shades. They are definitely different when swatched. They're not dupes for each other, but on the lids, they're not necessarily going to produce a very different effect. And similarly with a lot of these bluish shades, like for example, this shade and this shade, they're definitely different. Like this one has a little bit more teal to it than this one, but they're not necessarily going to look all that different on the lids. And I think this is something that's common in Natasha Denona palettes, in that I think her style of makeup artistry sort of leans towards having a lot of different textures of shades that look a bit similar, and that's a way for you to create a more multi-dimensional look. So not necessarily the most helpful if you're someone who really just likes to take, say, 4 shades and create a look out of that, and you don't really like having a lot of shades that look quite similar. But at least if you do want to have more variety in the subtle shade differences or in the textures, you definitely have that with this palette. I would say my only complaint with this palette would just be there's actually not a ton of depth despite how many shades you have. And what I mean by that is you can definitely get some depth with these blue shades. Those are definitely very pigmented. But let's say you don't want to dip into the blue shades. You don't have a ton of deep colors left. So for example, this is one of the deepest shades in the palette, and I would describe this more as a mid-tone brown than a deep brown. And similarly, this shade over here is one of the deepest shades, but it's definitely not a replacement for, say, a black or a deep brown. And then this shade is ironically also one of the deeper shades in the palette, but definitely when it's swatched, you can see it's much more mid-toned. So that's the one critique I would have in terms of this being a palette that has so many shades, but I feel like it's just missing that like deep brown or black shade, something that just really allows you to dial up the depth in your look. My only other comment would be, you could probably tell this during the swatches, but some of the textures are maybe a little bit harder to work with than the others. So the Chroma Crystal shades definitely are very flaky, and as you could probably see when I was swatching Blaze, a lot of it just kind of fell onto my lap. And so that's just something you can mitigate with your technique by being very careful with using a finger to apply these shadows and just barely dipping in. I find when I do swatches of this palette, everything swatches very pigmented and in somewhat thick layers, because a lot of these are in that more creamy formula, and the nature of a creamier product is you really don't need to dig in order to get a significant amount of product on your finger. But overall, this is a really gorgeous palette. You can probably tell there's just so many different directions you can go with in this palette. And for today's look, I tried to kind of take inspiration from this outfit that I have on, and I tried to play around more with the green tones, but also bring in a little bit of the gold and some of the neon yellow shades just to kind of match the brightness of my outfit. So without further ado, let's get into that demo. So I went ahead and completed my right eye, so now I'll show you guys on my left eye how I got this look. So to start off, as per usual, I'll take my Wayne Goss number 16 brush, and I'm going to dip into the shade Rope. So this is kind of the lightest shade in the palette, and so I like just starting out with this to kind of set my primer and just lay down some of this bright yellowy shade. Since I have such a neon dress on today, I figure it'll be good to bring in a little bit more of these bright yellow shades just to kind of, spruce up the eyeshadow look a little bit. Now with that same brush, I'm gonna go into Rhizome, which is kind of a similar shade, maybe a tad bit more orangey in undertone. And I'm just gonna go over Rope with that just to further build out some of this yellowy orange shade. And I find these powder mattes of Natasha Denona's really blend out like a dream. So next, with my Sonia G Classic Crease Brush, we're gonna go into Lethal. And this is the really gorgeous avocado green shade in this palette. And I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this shadow in that pretty much every time I reach for this palette, I'm very tempted to use this shade because it's just quite unique in my collection. And there's also just so many shades in this palette that work well with it. But the texture is a little bit tricky. I have a decent amount of fallout whenever I use this shade, and I find that it sometimes kind of balls up into little bits of pigment, which makes it a little bit trickier to work with. But we're just gonna sweep that all over the outer third and bring it in ever so slightly just to get a little bit more green into this look. Now with my Wayne Goss number 4 brush, I'm going in with Royal, which is the teal shade. And I'm going to just very slowly build that up in the outer third, just to bring that additional color to this look. And this shade is also a tad bit tricky to work with. As you can kind of see, we have a little bit of patchiness here. So you just need to be very patient, build it up in layers, and spend a decent amount of time blending it out. Taking my classic crease just to help out a little bit with the blending job. And now with my Wayne Goss number 4, I'm going into a Zoic, which is one of the deeper shades in this palette. And I'm gonna just try to use a little bit of this to further deepen the outer third. So you can see that just made the turquoise a little bit deeper and a little bit more muted. Next, with my Chikuhodo GSN 9 brush, I'm going in with Shield, which is one of my favorite shades in this palette. It's a really gorgeous metallic shimmer shade that connects a lot of the tones in this palette together. So it has that gorgeous gold, but also kind of that bronzy green khaki color as well. Next, with the finger, I'm going into Orium, which is a dual chrome shade, and I'm just scattering this glitter all over the middle of the lid. And Orium is one of my favorite shades to use. I love just adding it as a glitter topper. Next, with my Rephr number 3 brush, I'm going in to Blaze, which is a chroma crystal shade. And I'm putting this on the inner corner and also kind of along the inner third. Kind of brushing that upwards and outwards. And the chroma crystal shades are pretty flaky, so normally it's best to apply them with a finger. But since I'm trying to concentrate this on a relatively small area, I'm just going to slowly pack it on with this brush. So now for the lower lash line, I'm going in with my Esom G27 into Rope, and I'm first just going to kind of put this all over my eye bag area. Sort of bring it down so I can set my concealer and also match the smokiness of the upper lash line. Take a tiny bit of Rhizome as well, just to further build out that yellowy shade. Then I'm going to go into Troop just to add some of this greenish shade to the lower lash line. Cleaning off the brush, I'm going into Royal just to add some turquoise to the outer third. And then taking some Shield, I'm going in to the inner 2/3 with that shade. And finally, I'm just going to take a tiny bit of Noble and put that in the inner third, just to add a little bit more silver and light there. So to finish things off, I'm going to take my Sonia G Mini Booster in Queen and put some of that on the brow bone. Look at that shine. And also just take some of that for the inner corner as well, just kind of stamping it on top of Blaze, just to add some more light there. And then just taking a tiny bit of Rhizome on my Wayne Goss number 16, just gonna blend out the crease area. So that's the eyeshadow look done. I'm gonna go in now and finish off the rest of my face, and then I'll be back with my overall review of this palette. So here we are with the final look. What do you guys think? I went in with my M Cosmetics brush liner, and then for bronzer today, I went in with my Marc Jacobs Omega Bronze in Tantalize. And for blush, I used the Heaven's Veil from M Cosmetics in the shade Faded Clementine. And then I used Glow Goals from Ofra for my highlight. And for the lips, I used my Pat McGrath lip liner in the shade Structure, and then my Charlotte Tilbury Kissing Formula lipstick in the shade Yes Honey. Alrighty, so now let's dive into my overall thoughts about this palette. So first off, let me just say that this is quite a unique palette from Natasha Denona in that you have 28 shades, so the maximum number of Natasha Denona shadows in a single palette. But these are kind of smaller than her very large 28 pan palettes that she originally came out with. So this is kind of an interesting palette from a value perspective, because on the one hand, you're getting 28 shades, but for half of the price of her larger 28 pan palettes, because there's half as much product. So great value from that perspective. On the other hand, she has more recently been primarily coming out with 15 pan palettes, many of which are only $65. So it kind of depends on how much you like having a lot of different colors in terms of whether this is the best value Natasha Denona palette. For me personally, I really love this palette because it has such a diverse color story. So sometimes I'll go into this palette and just say, use these blue shadows, for example, and create a really blue ocean inspired look. Other times I'll go in and want to do something much more warm. So this is perfect if you want, say, like a sunset inspired look. You have all of these beautiful warm tones here. Overall, I find this is a palette that really inspires me to be a bit more creative, and especially I don't personally have a ton of greens and blues in the rest of my eyeshadow collection. So generally, whenever I pick this up, I'm really tempted by those shades. That said, I will say that this is a palette that I think is a little bit tricky for beginners to use. So I would say when I bought this palette, and as I mentioned at the top, this was one of my very first luxury eyeshadow palettes. I first was kind of struggling a bit with using this palette just because there are so many different textures and formulas in this. So for me coming in, I was really used to, you know, your shimmers and your mattes and like shimmer formulas that form well with a brush. Whereas here, for example, if you're looking at the dual chrome shades or the chroma crystal shades, those are really shades you should apply with a finger. And when it comes to Natasha Denona mattes, at least in this palette, there's multiple formulas that she has. So she has more traditional powder matte formulas, and those are really easy to use in my opinion. They really operate the way you expect a powder matte to operate. Her cream to powder formula though, for me is more hit or miss. For example, these two deeper shades at the bottom, I think this is Azoic and this one Antique, those I am generally fine with. I can sort of build it up well with a brush, so it works out as long as I just apply sheer layers. Lethal, on the other hand, is a shade that kind of breaks my heart because every single time I open this palette, I'm like, oh, I want to use Lethal because it's just so unique in my collection. But this shade is a lot trickier for me to work with. I find that it breaks up a little bit. The creaminess kind of causes it to ball up sometimes, and so you get a bit of patchiness, which usually I'm able to blend out, but it does take some work and there often is fallout as a result. So I would just say if you are kind of new to Natasha Denona shadows, this might involve some degree of a learning curve to get used to. So for me, the first several looks I did with this were a little bit disappointing. They were fun looks because the nature of this palette is you have so many beautiful colors and textures, like you'll create something fun on your lids, but maybe just, you know, not quite what you wanted. I think now that I've been using this for a while, and now also that I've upgraded my brush game and I have, you know, these Wayne Goss and Sonia G brushes and such, I think now this palette works really beautifully for me, and I'm able to really leverage all of these different textures and formulas to create very unique looks. But I just wanted to call that out because this palette itself is obviously a huge investment, and if you don't have necessarily the brushes, or if you are newer to using these types of formulas, then you might pick this up and be initially kind of disappointed. So in addition, as I mentioned at the top, I have filmed many previous videos with this palette doing all sorts of different looks, and those were all meant to be videos that I would upload, but because of various issues I encountered, I did not upload those videos. So now I'm just going to show you guys some of the other looks that I created, just because obviously in today's demo I only showed you this one look, but as you can tell from this palette, there's just so many different directions you can go into. So hopefully these pictures kind of give you guys some inspiration in terms of what other kinds of looks you can achieve with this palette. This first look was inspired by the movie Wolfwalkers, which I would highly recommend. So it has a lot of the orange inspired by Maeve's hair, and also some of the green to evoke the forest, and then this beautiful gold shimmer as well. The second look is a little bit more of your standard everyday bronzy golden look, but I incorporated some more oranges to make it just a little bit brighter. The final look has some Egyptian vibes, so it was inspired by the colors of the dress I had on that day, and I figured I would try using the blue in a slightly different technique, so here I have it on as liner. So I hope you guys enjoyed those looks, and thank you again for joining me for today's video. If you have the Metropolis palette, I would love to know down below what your thoughts of it have been, in particular because my personal experience with the palette has kind of been up and down and up at the very end. I'm curious if any of you have had similar experiences or if it was just smooth sailing the whole time. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all again for taking time to join me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!